G'day, I'm Martyn and this is The Truth of It. And on today's program, I'm going to be talking about the truth about Daniel Andrews, and I'm going to try and expose in detail his anti-faith agenda of 6+ years now. Secondly, I am going to be talking about the Ravi Zacharias scandal and picking out some sobering lessons for you and for me, for all of us, from that dreadful scandal. And finally, we're going to be going to my speech last week at the annual Walk for Life in Adelaide, and this one's a crucial one because abortion to birth laws are currently before the South Australian Parliament. You'll get to hear my speech. But first up, the truth about Daniel Andrews. A lot of Victorians are reeling after the passage of the Andrews government's change and suppression bill in Victoria, and I do not hesitate to say that this is the worst legislation of its kind in the entire world. There's nothing like this really anywhere else in the world proposed or actually in place. A lot of people say, well, you know, these conversion therapy, as they're called, bills are elsewhere, but there's nothing quite like this. This bill was criticised by the Law Institute of Victoria, which is the peak body for legal professionals, by no means conservative, let me tell you. It was also criticised by the Australian Medical Association, the peak body for health professionals, and pretty much all faith groups. Some 400 senior church leaders put their names to public statements rejecting the law. But if there's one thing about Daniel Andrews, it is his capacity to change nothing for anybody ever. He does what he does, and he does it with zeal, and he's got more and more emboldened in that over the years of his premiership. But when a man designs a law which is medically inappropriate according to the medical profession, legally inappropriate according to the legal profession, and singularly it seems targeted at imprisoning faith communities for such things as prayer, and it names prayer as one of the offences, or counselling their own children even to make them domestic abusers for doing that, or empowering bureaucrats in the Equal Opportunity Commission to police and control and re-educate faith communities, one's got to ask a question once and for all. After a number of years of this kind of stuff culminating in this law, what is it that is making Daniel Andrews tick? This is the worst attack on religious freedom, and indeed on certain kinds of people, as we'll get to, in a Western country in living memory. The only thing I can think of, sitting back and racking my brains, that came close would be the Scottish named persons scheme, which some of you would be familiar with from a few years back, and that was ultimately struck down. And Daniel Andrews, I think he's made a feeble attempt at saying that he's a good Catholic, but actions speak louder than words, and we're going to go through his actions. This is his record. He is Australia's longest serving major political leader. He's been in the job since the 4th of December 2014, and in 6 years, or just a tiny bit over that, he has done an awful lot. I'm going to go through some policy lowlights, not highlights, lowlights if you like, in categories: LGBTIQ stuff, life issues, education, which is a big one for him, something on religious freedom, something on his public comments about Christianity, and just give you a picture of the man. On LGBTIQ issues, and I'm going to go from what would probably be broadly considered least controversial to most controversial. So let's start with the low-level stuff in the eyes of much of the nation. In LGBTIQ, he was the government that created the nation's first equality minister. There is a minister in his government with that portfolio, and that portfolio is housed within, and he made a big point of this, within the Premier, or within the Department of Premier and Cabinet. There's also a Gender and Sexuality Commissioner as part of that portfolio, and this person is a full-time advocate for LGBTIQ+ issues within the government, right across the scope of government, and has the ear of the Premier himself. That's how a lot of these laws have come through. In 2015, the first year of his government, same-sex adoption was legalised so that a child can be placed in a motherless or a fatherless home. Now, I have absolutely no hesitation in saying that is wrong. Absolutely wrong. There are all sorts of imperfect circumstances that can unfortunately lead to a child not having a mother or a father, but where you're trying to place a child in the best possible circumstances, it is wrong to deny them a mother and father by design. It is wrong. Initially, there were no exemptions in that law for faith institutions, like, say, the Catholic Church Adoption Agency, to ensure that children could go to mother and father homes. There was no provision for that, but through advocacy, some of those exemptions were put back in, and that sort of victory is something you only really see from the first year of his premiership. He gets more bold, and there's very little of that comes later. In 2015 as well, his first year, he was the first Premier ever to walk in a Pride March. He led the Melbourne Pride March, and he hasn't missed one since. And now now in 2021, he's promised Melbourne Pride to become one of the largest LGBTQ events that there is. It's sort of supposed to be a globally significant celebration with lots and lots of events and so forth. So he's huge on the celebration of Pride issues. In 2017, he opposed same-sex marriage, the vote on same-sex marriage, I should say, because he said that the vote would unleash hate and bigotry. So that's what he thinks of those who oppose same-sex marriage or did oppose it at that time, that their views were hatred and bigotry. 2019, there was laws passed which said that a person can change their sex on their birth certificate whether or not they have had any medical treatment, and a child's sex can be altered on their birth certificate at will. In other words, this is a historical document that says you were born a man or you were born a woman. Now you can change it as you like. I can become a woman in a moment of time, and I can change my birth certificate, and the whole world has to acknowledge it. And that kind of gender ideology is everywhere in the government. In 2020, a discussion paper was released on a whole of government LGBTIQ strategy. So they're very, very clear about the fact they want this to shape every part of what they're doing. 2021, there is a Pride Centre to be opened in St Kilda. It was a $15 million commitment of the government. And this is a government space in which to host LGBT advocacy. Also in 2021, as I've just said, we had these conversion therapy laws. He can say what he wants about them. This is what he does say, in fact. He said some faith leaders have been critical of these provisions. When he says some, he means nearly all of them. Some faith leaders have been critical of these provisions, critical of a law to ban the worst form of bigoted quackery imaginable. This is not kindness and love or the protection of a vulnerable and persecuted group. This is not something to be proud of. This is not what I pray for. Victoria is a secular state. If equality is difficult for you, then that's on you. Okay, he says equality. He says this is bigoted quackery. He can say what he wants. The fact is that this law does things like, if a parent prayed for their own child with their child's request in relation to, say, gender dysphoria or sexual attraction, then that parent is committing a criminal offence, and that parent also is likely to become a domestic violence abuser. That's what the law actually does. Okay, so he can say what he wants, or indeed a medical practitioner who doesn't give an affirming medical treatment is on thin ice, or a pastor who prays for someone with their request. It governs the content of prayers. And it doesn't matter whether the person requests it or not, banned, potentially criminal. Or indeed a whole class of Victorians who, if they were not, say, people of faith, they would call themselves members of the LGBTQ community. But they are people of faith, they want to be people of faith first. These kinds of people tend to get together and talk about this stuff. They tend to create their own support groups and things like that. Nope, all criminal. And indeed, if someone like me were to dare to refer someone to one of these groups or whatever, criminal. It just erases that category of person. And you know, the media won't tell you and the government won't tell you, but there's quite a lot of them. Gender equality strategy is something that they have released more recently. They've got a government gender equality strategy, and it is a bit of a Marxist creed. I've just made some notes here on that. It is that it attacks the fact that women do more domestic work than men. And you see this a lot, by the way. There is a pretty serious undermining of the fact that Victorians might make their families the centre of their existence. You see that a lot in the government policy. There was a thing where the government is committed, for example, to make sure that all court appointments and all paid board appointments and all government ministerial appointments are at least 50% women. And look, if family life is flourishing and healthy and it's the centre of Victorian people's lives, you actually won't get as many women in the higher echelons of the workforce. That's the way it naturally works because women have babies. And if family life is to be championed, then you won't get that same level of obsession about 50-50 per se. But of course, there is an undermining of all of that stuff through the Andrews government. It bangs on about colonialism, this gender equality strategy, which is sort of Marxist terminology for a systemically oppressive society, which is the West. It bangs on about trans and gender diverse empowerment. It talks about, it attacks gendered clothing and all gender stereotypes, and it's very pro-abortion. The government has flown rainbow flags over government buildings on quite a number of occasions. I've got the list there, but I won't go through them. And here are some comments on Pride from Mr. Andrews himself. He said, "Pride is not a cold acceptance, it's a celebration." And we see that. Now it's got to the point where if you don't celebrate, if you just accept or tolerate, if you don't celebrate actively and affirm to the nth degree, then you're in a situation where you're potentially going to end up being charged with a criminal offence, or at least subjected to some kind of investigation by a bureaucracy or even the police force. That's what the Change and Suppression Bill does. So that's what he's after. And he says, if you're a member of the LGBTI community and there's someone in your life that you love, a partner or a friend, then do me a favour. Next time you're on a tram in Melbourne, hold their hand. Do it with pride and defiance, because you have that freedom. And here in the progressive capital, I think I can think of nothing more Victorian than that. Now, He will never say something like that to a person of faith. Never. To go out there and actually live out what you believe. No, this is not about equality. It's not about the same for everyone. It's not about tolerating everybody. This is about pride at the expense of everybody else. That's what he's about. That is the whole of government agenda. They have their own minister for it. All right, what about on life? And I think this is this is serious as well. In 2008, Daniel Andrews was actually the health minister in the state of Victoria, and that's when abortion to birth was legislated. And I mean that, abortion up to and including the point of birth. Victoria led the nation in this respect, and Andrews played a major role in getting the legislation passed. And he voted against all of the amendments that were put up against that legislation. And here are some of the amendments. Just hang on to your hats for a second. There was an amendment put up to require pain relief to be administered to a fetus that can feel the pain of being dismembered in an abortion. And fetuses beyond a certain gestation can, late term especially. Now he voted against that. And now, just to see what's going on, each year there's several hundred late term abortions in the state of Victoria. None of those children receive pain relief, even though they feel it. In 2015, for example, 310 late term terminations took place. That was a typical year. He also voted against an amendment that would have ensured that children who are born alive, as a result of abortion, which happens from time to time, must be rendered medical care. He voted against that. And now, for example, of the 310 late-term abortions in 2015, 33 of them were born alive, and what happened? They were left to die, slowly, alone, in Victorian hospitals. This is something which happens right across the country in all states, and where states have legalised late-term abortion, there's far more of it. It's barbarous, it's disgusting. And Andrews voted against a protection for those children who are dying every year by the dozens. He voted against a ban on partial birth abortion, which is the practice of literally delivering the baby to the neck so that its head doesn't come out and then murdering it. Mandatory reporting of he voted against an amendment to ensure that there would be mandatory reporting of suspected child abuse victims when they came into an abortion clinic. And that happens, anecdotal evidence says that happens quite a lot. He voted against an amendment that would have required the provision of information on the health risks of abortion. He voted against an amendment that would have offered women impartial decision-making counselling. He voted against an amendment that would have required the notification of the custodial parent of a child who is seeking an abortion. This is all pretty serious stuff. And he said afterwards, "I'm not a Catholic health minister, I'm a Victorian health minister." So in other words, he doesn't believe that his faith has real application in the public realm, which is strange for anyone who has faith. 2015, his government was involved in the legislation of what they called safe access zones. What that included was a 100-metre buffer being created around all termination clinics, abortion clinics, where communication on the subject of abortion in a way that could be seen or heard was banned, criminal offence. Now, the government did that with all sorts of rhetoric about women being harassed, etc. That was never happening. And indeed, if a woman was being harassed or obstructed or anything like that was going on, the Victorian police had all the power they needed to deal with that. That was never a problem. But what was happening was that there was people, like a group called the Helpers, who stood near abortion clinics in Victoria and made simple offers of help, usually by passing just a piece of paper to women who were approaching the clinics to say, "We can help you." Those people, those wonderful people, had been responsible for seeing more than 300 babies born alive who otherwise would have been terminated in those clinics over the course of their ministry. And now, one of the ladies who was a part of that ministry, Kathy Clubb, she is now a convicted criminal because she handed a piece of paper to a couple who were approaching a clinic. She's a convicted criminal because of her legacy of work of saving 300 lives. Now that is an outrage. And the Premier knew that. They received a submission from these helpers with photographs of all the children, many of the children that have been born, stories from their mothers, thank you letters and all sorts. They read them, and some of these kids sat in the gallery while this bill was being debated, and they passed the bill anyway. They knew exactly what they were doing. Unbelievable barbarism. It just makes me angry. 2017, Victoria became the first state in Australia, unless you count Northern Territory back in 1994 very briefly, but 1997 was it? Anyway, whenever it was, unless you count the brief episode in the Northern Territory. In 2017, the first state to legalise euthanasia and to currently have euthanasia in Australia. Andrews gave the Health Minister, Jill Hennessy, a big hug when that passed. Now, if you want to know what's wrong with euthanasia, go and look up euthanasia on our YouTube channel and you'll see my videos on the subject. It's all there. This is a big one, education. So the Andrews government in 2015 was responsible for removing special religious instruction from schools. They took it out of class time and they said that if you want to do it, you have to do it after school and for no more than 30 minutes. At the same time, they made respectful relationships compulsory in Victorian schools. And respectful relationships is sort of a safe schools of around 2, but it's more sophisticated and it includes a very Marxist idea of gender roles, very anti-family stuff, and a lot of dodgy stuff like the Safe Schools program had. It's all now embedded into the Victorian school curriculum. One provider of special religious instruction reported that in the year before the ban, for their classes, 27,000 students attended. In the year after the ban, only 1,000 students attended. Huge, huge impact on Christianity in the state. Also, regarding safe schools, which I just mentioned, the Safe Schools program, which most of you will know about, was funded and established by the Victorian government in 2010. Grossly inappropriate material was revealed in 2016 and it made national headlines. For example, kids were told to wear the uniform of their choice, and there was big posters with kids in the opposite sex's uniform, and also told how to become political activists. Also, online resources connected with the program actually joined kids up with pornographic websites, adult shops, swingers clubs, several alternative adult online communities, organisations that hosted hands-on workshops in all things sexual. And I don't even want to say what a lot of this stuff is because it's absolutely off the deep end disgusting. And then they also, these resources instructed kids on things like hiding their browsing history, how to go about getting those websites accessible at their schools. There was advice on being trans, on chest binding and worse, on things to do with male genitals and all the rest of it to be a trans person. Explicit advice on alternative kinds of sexual activity to children and so on. So what happened was that the federal government announced that they were going to review the material. They were going to do a review. Daniel Andrews immediately jumped on and backed it. And he said this: well, the bad news is that the Liberals are still on the warpath about safe schools, a brilliantly effective program designed to stamp out bullying, not pile it on. But there is some good news. If the Turnbull government decides to cut the funding for this program, I'm proud to announce that the Victorian government will make up the shortfall. We'll lock that funding in at a state level because if it saves one life, it's worth it. Safe Schools is officially saved in Victoria. He goes on to say, I get my policy advice from experts, not bigots. So apparently the people pointing all this out were just bigots, and the parents who would be concerned about this were just bigots. And also he sits there and raves on about how that he's going to save the funding for this thing. I'm sitting there going, right, so they're exposed for being quite perverted, and what you're going to do is pay them for it. Well, that was his approach. In 2015, guidelines were issued to Victorian schools which banned children from singing traditional Christmas carols that, quote, glorified God. Students were not to sing any praise music that included praise of God, and principals were to ensure that carols which welcomed the birth of Christ were not sung, including Silent Night, O Come All Ye Faithful, Away in a Manger, and We Three Kings. And elsewhere in the advice there was the mention of Hark the Herald Angels Sing and Once in Royal David City. Now, Andrews came out and made this blisteringly strong statement, as he always does, that we have not banned Christmas, we have not banned Christmas carols, but he did not address the more particular point, which is, no, you haven't banned Christmas carols, but you have banned Christmas carols that amount to, quote, hymns that glorify God. And that was the actual report that was in the Age newspaper, which is a left-wing newspaper, and he did not address that. That was a government advice issued to schools. He's also responsible for the Doctors in Schools program, which means that I think 100 schools in the state of high schools in the state of Victoria are visited by GPs, and students can go and get health advice and health care from these GPs, and the GPs get to decide whether or not they tell the child's parent about what's going on. Now you can imagine, so here you are putting a health professional in the child's way in an environment where the parent has no hope of finding out about it. And there's issues like abortion, there's issues like STIs, there's issues like gender dysphoria, which is humongous now, and kids are going down to the clinics, 1,500% increases in Victorian gender clinics, and kids going down with confusion. Parents may never find out about it. They may never find out about it. The GP just has to say, I think this kid's a mature minor. End of story. In 2019, school chaplaincy requirements were changed in the state of Victoria, so they no longer have to be Christians. They can be people with no faith or people with any faith. In 2016, there was a religious freedom effort. There was a change to religious freedom laws in Victoria. It was called the Inherent Requirements Bill, and what this did was it amended the Equal Opportunity Act to say that religious institutions cannot any longer hire staff that will support their ethos exclusively. And they're saying, oh, that's to improve, diversity and equality and all the rest of it. But of course, they were never going to change the rules around, say, political organisations. So, for example, Daniel Andrews' own political party, the Labor Party, they were never going to say, oh, well, we're going to make sure that the political parties can't hire people who share their ethos. They were never going to make sure that the LGBT Pride Centre can't hire people that share their ethos. They were never going to make sure that the LGBT Health Clinic can't hire people that share their ethos. Now, only the religious groups was targeted in that way. And that bill actually, amazingly, but this shows their attitude to religious freedom, and yet because it was 2016, I mentioned there were a couple of pushbacks then, it actually failed. And Daniel Andrews wasn't happy about it. This quote came out. He said, "The Andrews government is bitterly disappointed by the Liberal National Coalition's decision to oppose a key equality bill, which would have improved the lives of thousands of Victorians." I mean, just anti-religious freedom. States don't have a whole lot of power over that stuff, but that is one example of where they did. I want to make this closing comment, this closing example before I finish up, and that is that the thing that really ticked me off lately was his attitude to Margaret Court. Now, you don't have to agree with Margaret Court. I happen to. I think she's been dreadfully misrepresented, and they always pick grumpy photos of her for the media and all the rest of it. But she's a lady who believes what most Christians in this country believe, that marriage is between a man and a woman, that there are boys and girls and they get married and have families, and that's a good thing, that kind of stuff. Ooh, bigotry. But she was to receive Australia Day honours, and indeed she did. And Daniel Andrews was asked about it, and he said this: "I don't want to give this person's disgraceful, bigoted views any oxygen." Notice he can't even mention her by name. Twice he called her this person, once on his Twitter, once in the press conference. He said, "But when others insist on rewarding them with this country's highest honour, I think it's worth saying again, Grand Slam wins don't give you some right to spew hatred and create division. Nothing does." Well, and here he is treating her with such disdain. It's effectively bullying a 70-year-old woman to his hundreds of thousands of Twitter supporters. So way to go, what a guy. And here he is just expressing his complete disdain and saying that she's the bigot. This kind of view is the evil thing, and that's what his whole government has tried to say for years now. And yet this is a man who passes a law which criminalises parents who pray for their children. He can say that law's for whatever he wants to say, but it doesn't change the fact it criminalises parents who pray for their own children. It's the man who votes against an amendment to require medical care to be given to babies who are born alive. So now dozens of babies are born alive in Victorian hospitals and gasp for breath until they die. He's a man who hears that Safe Schools is sending kids to swinger clubs and X-rated adult sites, and then he offers to pay them. The man whose government bans songs which glorify God after showing special religious instruction on the back door and chucking it out of schools. The man who passed a law knowing it would make a mother of 13 into a criminal for helping women outside termination clinics and saving 300 lives. The man who changed adoption so that children can be placed with motherless and fatherless homes. The man who would see religious groups stripped of their right to be religious, but maintain his own political group's right to be political. The man whose government gives masses of funding to advocacy groups and clinics, which have seen well over 1,000% increases in children presenting for gender dysphoria in the last few years. Someone tell them the problem didn't exist until they started putting the idea into kids' heads. And these are irreversible therapies and treatments. You know, kids that can't choose their own bedtime, for heaven's sake, are going and getting gender dysphoria treatment and being affirmed in the opposite sex because what they say is best. Nobody in this country is responsible for a more radical and aggressive social engineering agenda than Daniel Andrews. And I want to say to Victorians, please wake up. Please, I know a lot of you have, but some of you haven't. And I haven't even covered the crazy response to COVID, for example, the fact that you're all down there in masks and the rest of the country isn't. I haven't covered the relationship to China. I haven't done any of that. I've just talked about these faith positions primarily. But I hope that at least some of those of you who are people of faith, or who are sympathetic to people of faith, can see this much. Daniel Andrews despises what you believe. And he has a passion against it that has now driven him for years, and he's getting worse, not better. He's getting bolder, not weaker. November 2022 is the next chance to vote this man out, and you must. That's the truth about Daniel Andrews and his anti-faith agenda. Second topic is more serious actually than, well, is it more serious? It's also another serious topic, and it is the Ravi Zacharias scandal. I'm here because this morning I woke up and I read the newly released report on that, and that is the final report into the investigation against the allegations that were made of him, and those allegations came up after he died, principally, and they were allegations of impropriety of largely a sexual nature, and the RZIM Ministries Board decided to commission an inquiry, and they've been very transparent. They've released that report as it was tendered to them by the group that was making the investigation. And I'm not going to read any part of it now because it is, to say the least, well, totally unedifying. The contents are shocking. They're really shocking. I mean, for those of you who are relying on the interim reports and so on, it's far worse. The situation, the level of misconduct, the level of sin is very, very serious. And these were sustained patterns of behaviour backed by patterns of deception over many years. It wasn't, or a number of years. It wasn't a one-off. And it's so bad that you do start asking questions and think, well, was this man a wolf in sheep's clothing? Was this, what's going on? Now, that's in God's hands to know and to judge now. And the issue, I'm not raising the issue to dwell on that side of it. I'm raising the issue because I actually do have something to say, which I think is important. And it's what occurred to me this morning when I woke up and read this report. This should be something that causes us to consider ourselves for a moment. Because as much as we're disappointed by what we see and hear, it's important to remember something. We must be alarmed at the nature of the human heart. Jeremiah 17:9 says this, a very strong verse if you think about it. The heart, it says, is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? And our hearts actually share the same disease as human beings. They are all sinners' hearts. They're all fallen hearts. They're all human hearts. And that should fill us with concern as we come across yet another sober reminder of that simple truth. We're told it often in Scripture. We don't like to believe it, and yet it must be true. You know, it's the source of that old quote, there but for the grace of God go I. And that is why we're told in Scripture above all that we must guard our hearts. Because they are sinful hearts, because they are deceitful hearts, because they are wicked hearts and we don't even know them, as Jeremiah said. Proverbs chapter 4:23-27 says, guard your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. Rid yourselves of a deceitful mouth and keep devious speech far from you. Let your eyes look directly ahead and let your gaze be fixed straight in front of you. Watch the path of your feet and all your ways will be established. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Turn your foot from evil. It says there that out of the heart flows the whole course of a person's life. And the siren songs of temptation and evil and sin, they'll come up on the right, they'll come up on the left, and they'll be urging you to turn aside. And it says here, fix your eyes ahead, or in New Testament language, fix your eyes on Christ, on Jesus, and do not be drawn away. And the heart, you see, can get you in the most dreadful trouble. It can get you in the most dreadful trouble. And I say, as Proverbs says, guard it, and pray that God will help you to guard it. And one of the best ways to guard it actually is to be full of truth and to think on truth and live by truth, because your heart will take you emotionally this way and that. But the mind can actually be a great anchor for it. That's one way. Guard your heart. And I'd like to make this point. There's a close connection of deception with this idea too in Jeremiah and Proverbs. And once we are off track, once we are doing wrong, it is true that the main way we sustain ourselves is by deceit. We come up with whatever denialism or whatever elaborate permission structure it takes to let us keep on doing what we're doing. We deceive ourselves. The heart's drawn away initially by evil desire. It comes up on the right, the left, we're drawn into it. And then it clings to that position by deceiving itself. Now that is something we're given to, we're prone to as human beings, and we pray that God preserves us from it. Now you might say, well, Martyn, I could never ever do the things described in that report. To which I say, well, there's a big part of me that shares the sentiment that says, well, no, I can't imagine anybody doing that. What's going on? What's wrong with a Christian leader to do that? Why? And yet, you know, you've got to be careful, because maybe that's our problem. I remember reading a survey of Christian leaders that had fallen into sin and had been removed from their leadership posts or gone through some kind of restoration process. And over 70% of them reported that they'd actually done something of which they believed themselves to be either entirely or almost entirely incapable. It was something that took them completely by surprise. And I recently heard someone ask what I thought was a very inappropriate question. They said, if the devil was going to take you down, how would he do it? I think it's inappropriate for two reasons. Firstly, it's just invasive. And secondly, Satan's not omniscient, so I don't know if it's a good idea to say it out loud and give him the extra data. But my reply was this. I think it would be something that hasn't even occurred to me. Because that is so often how it happens. And this anecdote or this evidence, this survey shows that that's how it happens. And we read in Scripture, who can know their own hearts? Very few people. Very few people really know. And that's why Jesus spoke about hypocrisy a lot. He knew that our tendency was to see clearly the faults in others, the errors in others, the bad things in others, but not see clearly the condition of our own hearts, not to see clearly our own problems. And he said, that's why he reminds us in Matthew 7, the measure you judge will be judged back at you. He says, just bear that in mind. You see clearly the problems with others, but what about yourself? You do not see back clearly the problems with you. And he gives that illustration. He says, you're going to see clearly a speck in someone's eye and lean forward and say, hey, you've got a speck in your eye. But he says, you just can't see that you've got a beam in your own eye, a whole piece of wood. And that is, such is the deceitfulness of the human heart, is that we don't see ourselves clearly. And these are just crucial principles, basic lessons for the Christian life. And I say none of this to minimize what Ravi has done, what it appears he's done, what the report seems to say. I minimize none of that. It is evil. It is wicked. People were hurt. His whole ministry is in smouldering ruins. There will be young Christians who are seriously stumbled by this, and God will judge, and that's a fearful thing. But if we focus exclusively on that, we'll be drawn into that and we will lose some of our perspective. And the perspective I want us not to lose is this. It is our own condition and the reminder that we too have sinners' hearts, and therefore we too must guard our hearts, because look how far they can lead us astray. I recall facing something of a crisis when I was 15, and I fell into that problem that I just mentioned, which is that obsessing over the fault in the other person, which is real, it's not that it's not there, but obsessing over it and losing perspective. And I was in the middle of a rant because I'd come across several people in quick succession. I'd realised that they were basically leading double lives, and they weren't they weren't living as Christians at all, despite outward appearances. And I was full of energy, and I was probably shouting, and the person next to me must have had enough of it, and they grabbed me by both of my shoulders, and they looked me square in the face, and they said, you know what your problem is? They said, you need to stop worrying so much about other people and start worrying about yourself. And it hit me like a bullet. I've never forgotten that. It stuck with me for the rest of my life. It's true, I can't actually control others. I can't stop the disappointments, and the disappointments will come, and this is not the last. The disappointments will come. I can't prevent the fakes. The fakes will always be out there. Indeed, I should expect it, because that's what the human condition is like, but for the superabounding grace of God, which I pray He extends to each one of us. But here's the thing. I can't control those things, but I can control me by God's grace. Guard your heart, says the Scriptures, for its deceitfulness is so great, it is given to wickedness, and out of it flows the issues of life. And it is true. The only way you can have the law of God written upon your heart is through Christ. And that can change you, but it requires a person to take up the call to live the Christian life and to understand these basic principles. That was the truth about the Ravi Zacharias scandal and some of the lessons for us. Third up, I'm going to bring you a speech. It is my speech from the Walk for Life in Adelaide. Down there, they're looking at legalizing abortion right up to the point and including the point of birth, some of the most cruel and barbaric laws that there are. We've seen these laws go through in Victoria, Tasmania, Queensland, New South Wales effectively swept the East Coast. Now South Australia is looking at doing the same. But the resistance is strong down there, and it was tremendous to see some 5,000 people show up at the Walk for Life just last week in Adelaide. Huge numbers, and also the advocacy has been so strong, the lobbying has been so strong, the advertising has been so strong, and I want to say thank you to all the teams down there, and not least of which is the ACL team and the ACL supporters who have done such a power of work. And we look forward to an incredibly close vote on the question of late-term abortion, potentially even the prohibition of late-term abortion. Let's see how that pans out. But I was there last week, and it was such an honour to address the 5,000 people at the annual Walk for Life. Here is my speech.
Well, thank you, Tishan, and thank you one and all for being here today. I've been to a lot of pro-life rallies. This would be one of the bigger ones for sure, and yet it's in one of... So well done, and yet it's in one of the smaller cities in this country. So well done for that. But as I've been to many rallies, it turns out that I've developed a favourite slogan. And I'm so glad it's on the armbands today, because my favourite pro-life slogan is "Love them both." And it's my favourite because it's true. There is a better way. There is a way to love them both. But also, it's my favorite because it tells us about what we ought to be doing and what we are doing. And I want to affirm something today, and it is that we are here for love. That is why we are here. And I want to understand, what is love? What does that slogan really mean? You know, Jesus defined love, and he defined it with a story, as he so often does. And he used the story of the Good Samaritan. And the Good Samaritan was a man who took a risk. He was a man who spent his own money. He was a man who used up his own time. He was a man who got down on his knees in the dust. And he was a man who followed up, and he was a man who spent from himself, person to person. And we learn from that story that to love is first to act. Without action, love is nothing. We learn that it is secondly to act at cost to ourselves. And we learn that it is thirdly not just to act at cost to ourselves, but in the highest and the true interests of others. That was the Good Samaritan. He acted. It was costly action, and it was in the highest and true interests of somebody else. I want to say this concerning that matter of action. Look around you. This is a movement of people who are taking action. And we do and we must continue to do so. We must speak up. We must rally. We must be politically motivated. We must respond to opportunities to do things. We must appeal to our neighbours. We must volunteer and give to charities, some of whom will be represented here today who are in the pro-life space. And we must, most importantly, be pro-life examples. We must walk the talk. We must live lives that are testimonies to what we believe. That is action, and we must act, and we do act. But concerning the matter of cost, I want to make this point. It will cost to do this. It will cost you time. It will cost you money. It will cost you convenience. It will cost you emotionally to care about these things, believe me. And it will, in some cases, cost you your reputation. And that is why I want to say thank you especially to the politicians who are here today, because they do it at cost. I want to make this clear point as well. It's not merely action at cost, but it truly is in the service of others. It truly is out of love for others, because these things are not for ourselves. If they were for ourselves, we'd be doing something else with our time. These things are for others. They are for the women who we see in our mind's eye who need a better way. They are for the men who we see in our mind's eye who need to stand up and be men. They are for the children we see in our mind's eye who die, and they die terrible deaths when they have done neither right nor wrong, when they are innocent. We say, love them both. And when we do, we speak in the highest and best interests of others. And so let's say again together, love them both. We've got a very excited group down here. We'll have more of this, don't worry. The pro-choice mindset speaks very differently. Do you know, I have found more and more that the final retreat of pro-choice thinking comes down to a single word, or two words that mean the same thing. The first one is choice, pro-choice. The second one is autonomy. And choice, we are told, is what's best. That's where empowerment can be found, in the autonomy to choose to end a life. That is a lie. It is a diabolical lie which is circulating among us, that the best thing we can do in this life is serve ourselves. And we see where it leads when people are lied to like this. When a woman is lied to like this, she terminates a life that needed her. The life that she was created to love and nurture from the very beginning, because from the beginning she was called mother in creation. It terminates a life that he was made to protect and guard from the very beginning, because from the beginning in creation he was called keeper, which also means protector. This is the evil reverse image of love. The love of Christ, the love of the Good Samaritan that was perfected in Christ, says, I will die for you. Choice, autonomy, abortion, they say, you will die for me. That word autonomy is a wicked lie. It kills, it destroys, and it immiserates. Because we are not autonomous anyway. It's a lie. It's not true. Our very breath is in the hand of God. But also we are called not to be those who live for ourselves, but those who live for others. And so we stand here today in the full confidence that there is a better way, and that by being here we are doing what we are called to do, which is we love them both. You know, the cost of autonomy, that lie, is almost unthinkable. I sat down recently and had dinner with a federal politician, and they showed me some research that was commissioned by the Parliamentary Library. And the question they asked the library was, how many children are born alive and left to die as a result of failed abortion in the nation of Australia? Only some states keep that data. And yet over the last 10 years, I was staggered to find that there are hundreds and hundreds of known cases of that very thing taking place. And we know that when abortion to birth is legislated, that practice only increases. And they can dress that up in buzzwords like healthcare and autonomy all they like, but it doesn't make it right. It is wrong, it is wicked, it is death. The Attorney General's own FAQ published on this bill says this. It says that in a late-term abortion, the baby may be induced, in which case, and I quote, it is wrapped in a blanket and the mother is given the opportunity to hold the baby as it dies. That is in the FAQ published by the AG's department in this state on this bill. And in many cases, let me tell you, that baby is not held. It dies alone. Renowned surgeon Dr. Ben Carson says this. He says, I've had the privilege of being able to operate on babies that were 25, 26, 27, 28 weeks gestation, and I can guarantee that they can feel. They can react. You have to give them anesthesia if you're going to cut them, believe me. But they can also respond to comfort and to warmth. And for somebody to say that that's a meaningless bunch of cells, honestly, it's just totally ignorant. These are lives. And before they reached that level, at 4 weeks, the heart was beating. Do you know it's worth remembering that abortion stops a beating heart? This law is a law that will enable people to stop a beating heart. Now you tell me whether or not that's the ending of life. Of course it is. We know it in our very soul that it is. This child has its own DNA, its own blood type. It's not its mother, it is living within its mother. Do you know, others will tell their stories, but I want to just quote one. Laurie. I read this online. She says, I'll wake up in the middle of the night. This is post-abortion grief. I'll wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear a baby crying. I simply miss my baby. I constantly wake up wanting to nurse my child, wanting to hold my child. And that's something the doctor never told me I would experience. And I read that and I thought, of course she does. What did I say before? From the very beginning in creation, what was she called? Mother. It's what she's made, one of the things she's made to do. The pain that this lie brings about, the cost of this is unthinkable. And again, I say we are confident today when we stand here that we are here to love them both. And how much, before we clap, how much of a smaller cost is this than the cost of that lie being allowed to continue? And so we love them both. I'd like to finish by reaffirming one thing. I'd like to reaffirm that this is worth it. I would like to reaffirm that when you do love them both, when you do act at cost in the service of others, it is worth it. And it is worth it on 3 levels. Firstly, it's worth it on a person-to-person level. Do you know, even if legislation doesn't change, the very existence of a pro-life voice in any community makes a difference. We put out videos, we put out materials, we put out stuff, we say things, and I am contacted continually by people who have been changed by that material. And it's the same when there are pro-life ministries, when there's a pro-life voice, when there's a rally in a place like this, it makes a difference. And you can make a personal difference, and I call this the quiet change because often you don't even hear about it. So never lose hope that God doesn't use the voice of truth in any community, even if it doesn't change legislation, to change people and save lives. He does. It's also worth it at a political level. And I want to make this point. This abortion to birth stuff has been going around the country. Victoria, I think, was first. And that happened, and it happened with the government ramming it through. Then Queensland took place, and Queensland had some trouble. They had to do 2 bills, and there was a little bit of problems and trouble and all this kind of thing, and people pushing back, and they got it through. And then New South Wales happened. And what happened in New South Wales nearly broke the parliament and nearly broke the government apart. It was an incredible uprising, an incredible outpouring of concern, so much so that the government in New South Wales put legislative policy changes on the back burner after that for fear of rousing up the same community again. And here you are in South Australia, and I have to say, for a city this size to have this many people is astounding. For the government to have meant to vote on this bill this week and for some reason unknown have put it off is astounding. And for us to be sitting here saying, you know what, there could be a chance here that we could ban late-term abortion, that is not like anything that's happened in this country in any other state. So well done. It is worth it politically. But let me close on this quote, and I quoted this last year, and this is so important for us to raise our eyes and get the big picture. It's not just worth it personally, it's not just worth it politically, it is worth it eternally. There is that quote that many of you will know from Congressman Henry Hyde, and it goes like this. I used to think it was poetry, but there's an important truth in this. He says, when the time comes, as it surely will, when we face that awesome moment, the final judgment, I've often thought, as Fulton Sheen wrote, that it is a terrible moment of loneliness. You are there alone, standing before God, and a terror will rip through your soul like nothing you can imagine. But I really think that those in the pro-life movement will not be alone. I think there'll be a chorus of voices that have never been heard in this world, but are heard beautifully and clearly in the next world. And they will plead for everyone who has been in this movement. And they will say, God, spare him because he loved us. And here's the thing, again, it is to love that we are here. It is for love of them both, the children we see in our mind's eye, the women we see in our mind's eye, and yes, even the men we see in our mind's eye. It is to do the right thing. And Jesus spoke in Luke's gospel of using our earthly possessions and wealth and material things to, and I quote, make friends who will receive you into eternal dwellings. And that is what we do here today. We have friends. And I believe many of us who know Jesus will be there to see them one day. And I want to say to you, it is worth it eternally to do this. So let us love them both. Thank you.